My name is Leo, 33, a cobbler by trade. I've lived in this small ski town for most of my life, and my shoe store is the kind of place where people come for good quality work and a chat about life. My wife, Madison, 34, works for the city council in a managerial role, and we've always had what I thought was a solid marriage. We've got a kid, our 12-year-old son, Ethan, who's just started middle school. As a family, we love camping. Most weekends, when the weather's good, we'd pack up the car and head into the mountains, just the three of us, leaving everything behind for a while. But this past January, the cracks in my seemingly perfect life began to show. It was the eve of our city's big winter festival, a time when the town swells with tourists, and Madison was busier than ever. The city council had their hands full organizing the event, and she worked late into the night. She'd be gone before I woke up, and would come home long after I was already asleep. For weeks, we barely saw each other. I missed the way things used to be when life wasn't so hectic. One morning, I noticed that Madison had forgotten her lunch on the kitchen counter. It was one of those moments where I thought, why not surprise her at work? Maybe we could have lunch together, catch up a bit. So, I made a plan. I'd bring it to her later that day, maybe around noon when the store got quieter. But as fate would have it, my store was flooded with tourists that day. People were buying winter boots, gloves, and scarves in a frenzy, preparing for the festival. By the time I closed up shop, it was late. But I was determined. I packed Madison's forgotten lunch, hopped in the car, and decided to swing by the city hall to surprise her. When I got there, the place was quiet, nearly empty. A few stragglers were around, finishing up last-minute preparations for the festival. I asked a passerby if they had seen Madison, and they told me she was in a meeting with the mayor, Tom, in one of the conference rooms. Now, I knew Tom well. He was the type of guy who always had a joke on hand and could charm his way through any conversation. We'd shared a few beers after council meetings, and over time, I'd grown to trust him. But that night, something was different. When I walked into that conference room, Tom was standing near the window, his back stiff and his face red. He seemed nervous, caught off guard. "Hey, Tom," I said casually, trying to play off the tension. "Is Madison around?" For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes darted to the floor, and then back to me, like he was trying to figure out what to say. "No," he finally mumbled, avoiding eye contact. That's when I heard the faintest noise coming from under the conference table. I dropped my bag on the floor, pretending I was just being clumsy. When I bent down to pick it up, I saw her. There, under the table, was Madison. My heart stopped. In that split second, it all came together. I saw red, pure, blinding rage. Without thinking, I shoved Tom aside, sending him stumbling back. Madison crawled out from under the table, her face pale and flushed with embarrassment. She quickly wiped her mouth on her sleeve and said the most cliché line I'd ever heard. "It was a mistake, Leo. I didn't mean it." I couldn't hear her anymore. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. My hands shook, my breath caught in my throat, and I turned on my heel, walking out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going, but I ended up at a small bar downtown. I sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey and letting the bitterness sink in. Hours passed, and all I could think about was how to make them both pay. Madison, the woman I thought I knew, and Tom, the man who I trusted. Revenge wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. And that night, a plan started to form in the back of my mind. The next morning, after a sleepless night of tossing and turning, I woke up with one thought burning in my mind: revenge. I wasn't going to sit back and let this humiliation consume me. Madison and Tom weren't just going to walk away from this unscathed. The first thing I did was file a formal complaint against Tom at City Hall. I knew the town loved a good scandal, and I had to be smart about this. I didn't make it about the affair, not yet. Instead, I accused him of abusing his position of power, painting a picture where Madison had been coerced, a vulnerable victim caught up in his web. The irony was bitter, but I knew how people would react. The town would rally behind her. Tom, on the other hand, would be a target. But that was just the beginning. I needed something more concrete, something that would guarantee their downfall. I reached out to a buddy of mine, Mark, who worked with security systems. He wasn't just any guy in the business, he had access to all the city's cameras. I asked him to pull any footage from the hall that might have caught Madison and Tom slipping away during the nights she'd stayed late. I wasn't sure if I'd find anything, but I knew it was worth a shot. What exactly are you looking for? Mark asked, raising an eyebrow as we sat in my store, the sound of the shoe repair machine humming in the background. Let's just say I need to know if there's been anything out of the ordinary, I replied, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to come off as a paranoid husband, but Mark could sense something was off. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll see what I can dig up. The hours dragged by as I waited for Mark to get back to me. My mind kept drifting back to that image Madison crawling out from under that table, her face flushed with guilt. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to me, pretending to be working late while sneaking around with Tom? The anger was simmering beneath the surface, but I knew I had to keep it together. Losing control wasn't an option. By the time Mark called me that evening, my nerves were frayed. I rushed over to his office, my heart pounding in anticipation. I think I found something, Mark said as he pulled up the footage. The screen flickered, and there it was clear as day. Madison and Tom sneaking out of a side door, laughing, their bodies too close for it to be professional. But that wasn't the worst of it. As he fast-forwarded through the clips, the camera caught something more damning. Madison and Tom, locked in an intimate embrace, completely unaware that the cameras had picked it up. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but at the same time, I knew this was exactly what I needed. Send me everything, I said, my voice cold and steady. Mark glanced at me, sensing the shift in my tone, but didn't ask any more questions. He handed me a USB drive and wished me luck, but I could tell he was unsure of what I planned to do next. With the footage in hand, I knew the next step was to time my moves carefully. Tom was popular in town, but I had leverage that could ruin him. I started to form a plan, one that would not only expose the affair but make it impossible for either of them to recover. I wasn't going to confront Madison, not yet. Instead, I decided to play along, let her think she was in the clear for a little longer. After all, the longer she believed she'd gotten away with it, the sweeter it would be when her world came crashing down. I headed home, and when I walked through the door that night, Madison was already there, sitting on the couch with Ethan, pretending like everything was fine. She smiled at me, and it took everything in me not to let my anger show. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked casually, as if she hadn't spent the night before betraying me. I smiled back, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Busy, but good," I said, keeping the conversation light. Inside, I was seething, but I knew I had to play the long game. For the next few days, I acted like everything was normal. I went to work, came home, ate dinner with my family. Madison probably thought the worst had blown over. Little did she know, her days of living in blissful ignorance were numbered. Because the plan was in motion, and soon, neither of them would know what hit them. A few days passed, and I carried on with life as though nothing had changed. Madison, oblivious to the storm brewing, went about her days, smiling, laughing, even throwing in a few late nights at City Hall. I wondered how she could look me in the eye and act like everything was fine. It only fueled my determination. I kept thinking about Ethan. He adored his mother, and I knew that whatever happened next would hit him hard. That was the toughest part. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen, and I wasn't going to let her deceit continue. The video evidence I had was powerful, but I wanted to be sure. I wanted to crush them completely, leave no room for excuses. So, I decided to dig deeper. Tom was always careful about his image, and Madison wasn't dumb, either. They thought they were being discreet. But the thing about small towns is that everyone talks, especially when they think they know a secret. I had a few friends around town, people who kept their ears to the ground, and I asked them to keep an eye out. A couple of them worked in local businesses, places where Tom and Madison might stop in, unaware that eyes were on them. A week later, I got a call from one of them, Claire, who worked at a small cafe just a few blocks from City Hall. "Leo, you're not going to believe this," she whispered into the phone. "They're here, right now, Tom and Madison. And they're not exactly being subtle." I gripped the phone tighter. "What are they doing?" "Sitting in the back corner, holding hands. They look pretty cozy." I could hear the disgust in her voice. "Can you take a picture?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Already on it," Claire said, her voice low. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed, and there it was. A photo of Tom and Madison, sitting close, hands intertwined across the small table. The kind of image that spoke louder than any words. "Thanks, Claire. I owe you one," I said, ending the call. This was the final nail in their coffin. I knew what I had to do next. The town's winter festival was coming up, and it was the biggest event of the year. Madison and Tom were at the center of organizing it, and it was the perfect stage for what I had planned. They wouldn't see it coming. The night before the festival, I put everything in place. First, I sent an anonymous tip to a local reporter, a guy who loved digging up dirt on public figures. I made sure he got copies of the footage and the cafe photo, with just enough context to pique his interest. Then, I made a few more strategic moves. By morning, whispers had already started to spread. I could feel the tension in the air as I walked through town. People were talking about Tom, about Madison, and the story was slowly leaking out. That afternoon, I paid a visit to Tom's office at City Hall. I didn't bother knocking. I walked straight in, holding the USB drive and a manila folder with the cafe photos. "Leo, what the hell?" Tom started, his face a mix of surprise and panic. I slammed the folder on his desk, cutting him off. "You think you're smart, Tom? Think you could sneak around and no one would notice?" His face turned pale as he opened the folder and saw the photos. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "There's more," I said, pulling the USB from my pocket and waving it in front of him. "Footage." The cameras at City Hall caught everything. "Leo, wait, this isn't. Don't you dare try to explain this away," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I could ruin you right now, and I'm not just talking about your job. I'm talking about your entire life." Tom slumped in his chair, defeated. He knew he was caught, but what I said next really wiped the smugness off his face. "I sent everything to the local press. By tomorrow, the entire town will know exactly what kind of man you are." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked out of his office, leaving him in stunned silence. The festival went on that night, but something was different. The energy was off. Madison tried to keep up appearances, but I could see the cracks forming. People were whispering, pointing. It wouldn't be long before the whole thing blew wide open. As I stood on the sidelines, watching her from afar, I realized that I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The revenge I had so carefully crafted was set in motion, but as I saw the confused look on her face, I felt a strange emptiness creeping in. This was far from over, and deep down, I knew the fallout would change everything for both of us. The night of the festival, the town square was packed with people. Music played, lights twinkled, and kids ran around, laughing as they threw snowballs and danced under the glowing decorations. It was the perfect picture of small-town joy, but underneath it, the real storm was brewing. I could see it in the way people whispered to each other, eyes darting toward Tom and Madison whenever they appeared. I kept my distance, watching everything unfold from the sidelines. The festival had always been Madison's pride and joy. She loved organizing it, loved the attention that came with being at the center of the town's biggest event. But this year, the spotlight was a little too bright. The whispers were getting louder, and I could see her smile falter as people around her started exchanging glances. Tom was trying to keep his cool, but he looked like a man walking on thin ice, barely holding it together. I could tell he knew it was only a matter of time before the story broke wide open. Then, it happened. I was standing near one of the food stalls when I saw Claire from the cafe approach Madison. She had a look on her face that I recognized. Claire wasn't one to hold back when she had something to say. "Madison," Claire started, her voice loud enough for a few people nearby to hear, "I saw you at the cafe the other day, with Tom." Madison's eyes widened, her face going pale. She opened her mouth, probably to brush it off, but Claire wasn't done. "I've known Leo for years. He doesn't deserve this," Claire said, her voice steady. "Everyone's talking, Madison. It's not a secret anymore." By now, people were turning to listen. A small crowd was starting to gather, and the tension in the air was thick. Madison glanced around, her eyes darting from face to face, as if she was searching for someone, maybe Tom, maybe me. She looked like she was trapped, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I don't know what you're talking about, Madison stammered, trying to sound calm, but it was clear she was floundering. This is ridiculous. But it wasn't ridiculous, and she knew it. She could see it in the faces of the people around her, the judgment, the whispers. Her perfect image was crumbling. Right there in the middle of the festival she had worked so hard to create. That's when the reporter I'd tipped off showed up. He wasn't subtle about it either, walking up with a camera in tow, ready to capture the downfall of the town's golden couple. Madison, Tom care to comment on the rumors going around? The reporter asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Tom finally appeared, pushing through the crowd with a look of sheer panic on his face. He grabbed Madison's arm, pulling her away from the reporter and the growing number of people watching the scene unfold. But it was too late. The damage was done. I could see Madison trying to whisper something to Tom, her face a mix of fear and anger, but whatever plan they had to control the situation had already unraveled. The reporter pressed forward, asking more questions, and I could see Madison's composure slip further with every step. I stayed in the background, unnoticed, watching it all go down. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see them exposed, humiliated. Their lives turned upside down just like mine had been. As the crowd grew and the whispers turned into full-on conversations, Tom and Madison disappeared into the night, retreating from the public eye. I could still hear the reporter shouting after them, trying to get a comment, but they were gone, fleeing from the chaos that had finally caught up with them. The festival continued, but it felt different now. The mood had shifted, the energy dulled. People were still smiling, still enjoying the night. But there was an undercurrent of gossip in the air. Everyone knew the scandal that had just exploded in front of them. I didn't follow Tom and Madison. I had done what I came to do. As I stood there in the cold, watching the town I'd grown up in react to the downfall of two of its most prominent figures, I expected to feel triumphant. But instead, all I felt was a deep, gnawing emptiness. The satisfaction I thought revenge would bring wasn't there. I started walking toward my car, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe I thought that once the truth was out, the weight of their betrayal would lift. But it didn't. The betrayal still sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. When I got home that night, Madison wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. She wouldn't come back, at least not tonight. I sat on the couch, staring at the family photos we had on the wall. The three of us, me, Madison, and Ethan, smiling happy. But those smiles felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who hadn't been lied to, betrayed. As I sat there in the silence of our empty house, it hit me. The revenge was done, but the pain was still there. And now, there was nothing left to do but pick up the pieces. The next morning, the town was buzzing with news of the scandal. It was all anyone could talk about. Madison and Tom, exposed for the affair they thought they could hide. Everywhere I went, people were whispering, exchanging glances, and avoiding the subject when I walked into a room. They knew I was the husband at the center of it all, the one who'd been betrayed. I dropped Ethan off at school that day, trying to keep things as normal as possible for him. He didn't know the full extent of what had happened, just that his mom had been working a lot lately and things between us were tense. I wasn't sure how much longer we could shield him from the truth, but I wanted to protect him for as long as I could. When I got back to the shop, a few regulars stopped by, offering awkward condolences. They tried to act like they were there to buy something, but I could see the pity in their eyes. It made my stomach turn. I wasn't the one who had made a fool of myself. I wasn't the one who had lied, but somehow, I was still the one everyone felt sorry for. By mid-afternoon, I got a call from Madison. My heart sank when I saw her name pop up on my phone. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her stew in the mess she'd created. But I knew we couldn't avoid the inevitable conversation forever. "Leo," she said, her voice cracking on the other end of the line. "We need to talk." I stayed silent for a few seconds, just letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "Yeah, we do," I finally replied, my voice colder than I intended. "Where are you?" "Home," she whispered, sounding small and broken. "Can you come by?" I hung up without another word and grabbed my jacket, bracing myself for the conversation that was about to happen. When I walked into the house, Madison was sitting at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when I came in, her eyes swollen and red from crying. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." I stood there, arms crossed, feeling the anger rise in my chest again. "That's what you said the night I found you. That you didn't mean for it to happen. But it did, Madison. You made a choice, and now we're here." She broke down, sobbing, her shoulders shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I don't even know why it happened, Leo. I felt lost. Everything was so overwhelming, and Tom, he was just there." I let her words sink in, the excuses, the weak justifications. I wanted to shout at her, to tell her how pathetic it all sounded. But instead, I stayed quiet, my anger simmering beneath the surface. "So that's it?" I asked after a long pause. "You were stressed, and Tom was there? That's supposed to explain why you threw everything away? Our marriage, our family?" She looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. "I didn't want to lose you, Leo. I was just confused." "Confused?" I repeated, incredulous. "You weren't confused when you were sneaking around with Tom, were you? You weren't confused when you lied to me, night after night, pretending everything was fine." "I know," she whispered. "I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But please, Leo, we can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone. For Ethan's sake." I shook my head, feeling a mixture of pity and anger. "Ethan," I muttered, finally letting the weight of our son's name hang between us. "Do you even realize what this is going to do to him? How this is going to tear his world apart?" Madison sobbed harder, her hands clutching the sides of the chair like she was holding on for dear life. "I'll do anything, Leo. Please. I'll leave the council. I'll cut all ties with Tom. Just don't give up on us." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's too late, Madison. You already gave up on us the moment you crawled under that table with him. The moment you chose him over me. Over Ethan." Her face crumpled, and she slumped in the chair, defeated. "So that's it? We're done?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. There was too much pain, too much betrayal still swirling inside me. But as I looked at her, broken and lost, I realized something. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the trust that had been shattered, the life we had built that would never be the same. "We're done," I said quietly, the finality of the words hanging in the air. "I'm filing for divorce," Madison gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if she hadn't really believed it would come to this. But I knew it was the only way forward, the only way I could begin to rebuild my life without her. "I'll move out tomorrow," I added, turning toward the door. "We'll figure out what to tell Ethan. But this is over." As I walked out of the house, leaving Madison behind, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't the satisfaction I had once craved from revenge. It was something deeper, a release. I had taken control of my life again, broken free from the lies, and now I could begin to heal. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't want to drag things out or make a scene. Madison and I had already agreed to keep things civil for Ethan's sake, but the tension between us was unbearable. It was clear that our marriage was over, and now we had to figure out how to move forward separately. I found a small apartment on the edge of town, not too far from Ethan's school, so I could still be around for him. The place wasn't much, but it was enough for now. I set up a simple space with a few essentials and tried to make it feel like home. But there was no denying the emptiness. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. Ethan hadn't asked many questions yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he started piecing things together. Madison and I had agreed to sit down with him that weekend, to tell him about the separation in a way that wouldn't crush him. But no matter how we framed it, he was going to feel the impact of our broken marriage. And that thought weighed on me like a ton of bricks. The day we told him, we sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had confronted Madison about the affair. Ethan, oblivious to the tension between us, sat across from us, fiddling with his phone. "Ethan," I began, my voice steady but heavy, "your mom and we need to talk to you about something important." He looked up, confused but curious. Madison sat next to me, her eyes downcast, as if she couldn't bear to face him. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Your mom and I, well, we're going to be living in different houses for a while. It's not because of anything you did, and it's not your fault at all. Sometimes, adults just stop being able to live together the way they used to. His face went pale. What do you mean? You're getting a divorce? I glanced at Madison, who nodded, wiping away a tear. Yes, honey, but we both love you very much, and that's never going to change. We'll still both be here for you, just in different ways. He stared at us for a long moment, the shock settling in. So, you're not going to live here anymore, Dad? No, buddy, I said gently, my heart breaking with every word. I have a new place nearby. You'll spend time with me there, and you'll still have your room at both places. Ethan didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, processing. Finally, he muttered, "Why can't you just fix it? Can't you? I don't know. Try harder?" Madison finally spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "We've tried, sweetie. We really have. But this is something that we can't fix. But no matter what, you're the most important thing to us. We'll both always be here for you." Ethan pushed his chair back abruptly and stood up. "I don't get it. Why can't you just be like you used to?" I watched him retreat to his room, the door closing softly behind him. I wanted to chase after him, explain it all in a way he could understand. But how do you explain the betrayal of trust, the crumbling of a marriage, to a 12-year-old? There were no easy answers, no words that could make it better. Later that night, I lay in my new apartment, staring at the ceiling. The silence was suffocating, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I had done what needed to be done, but it didn't feel like a victory. In fact, it felt like a loss on all fronts. I hadn't heard much about Tom since the scandal broke. He had resigned from his position as mayor within days, the pressure of public shame too much for him to handle. Rumor had it that he'd left town altogether, and good riddance, as far as I was concerned. Madison, on the other hand, had lost her job at the city council. Her reputation had been dragged through the mud, and there was no recovering from it, not in this town. As much as I wanted to hate her, to revel in the fallout of her choices, I couldn't shake the lingering sadness that came with it all. This was the woman I had loved, the mother of my child. Now, she was a stranger to me, someone I couldn't recognize anymore. And I knew she was feeling the weight of it too. The next few weeks were a blur. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the shop to avoid the empty apartment. Ethan stayed with me on weekends, and we tried to keep things normal, going camping, playing video games, doing the things we always loved to do. But even with him, there was a heaviness between us, an unspoken sadness that lingered. One Saturday, as we sat around a campfire during one of our trips, Ethan finally asked, "Is this because of something Mom did?" I felt my stomach knot. I had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't want to throw Madison under the bus, no matter how much she deserved it. "It's complicated," I said carefully, poking at the fire with a stick. "What happened between your mom and me? It's something that's hard to explain, but it's not something I want you to worry about. It's between us." Ethan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with the answer. He kicked at the dirt, staring into the flames. "I just don't get it. You were so happy. We were all happy." I sighed, feeling the ache in my chest. "Yeah, we were. But sometimes things change. People change." He didn't say anything after that, but I could feel the weight of his confusion. I hated that he had to go through this, but there was no undoing it. This was our new reality, and I had to make peace with it. That night, as we lay in the tent, I made a promise to myself. No matter what, I would be there for Ethan. I would do everything I could to make sure he felt loved and supported, even as our family fell apart. I couldn't fix what had been broken, but I could be there for him, through every painful step of this journey. The months after the divorce were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. Life became a constant juggling act between rebuilding my own sense of self and being there for Ethan. I tried to keep things normal for him, despite how different everything was. We established a new routine, splitting his time between my place and Madison's, but there was an awkwardness in our interactions that hadn't been there before. He was adjusting, but it wasn't easy. Madison had moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of town. She kept a low profile since the scandal, avoiding most public places and focusing on starting over. Our interactions were brief and cold, usually centered around Ethan's schedule or school events. We hadn't had a real conversation since the day I told her I was filing for divorce. That distance, while painful at first, became something I grew to appreciate. It allowed me to heal, even if just a little bit at a time. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed at my place, I sat on the porch with a beer, staring out at the mountains. The quiet had become familiar, a stark contrast to the chaos of the last few months. I'd always loved the peacefulness of living in this town, the way the snow blanketed everything in the winter, the crisp air that came with the change of seasons. But lately, the peace had felt more like isolation. I'd started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me process the anger, the betrayal, and the lingering pain. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that it was okay to have setbacks, okay to not feel over it, just because the worst was technically behind me. But what stuck with me the most was something she said during one of our sessions. Forgiveness isn't always about letting someone back into your life. Sometimes, it's about letting go of the hold they have on you. It made sense, but letting go wasn't as simple as it sounded. Madison had tried reaching out a few times, sending messages about wanting to talk, to make amends. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I ever would be. The hurt she had caused was still too raw, the memories of her betrayal too vivid. Every time I saw her, I felt a mix of anger and sadness, and I wasn't sure which feeling was worse. One evening, I finally agreed to meet with her. Not for reconciliation, but for closure. We met at a small cafe neutral ground. Madison looked tired, worn down in a way that went beyond just physical exhaustion. There was a heaviness about her, like she'd been carrying the weight of her mistakes for too long. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly, stirring the tea in front of her. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What did you want to talk about?" Madison hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the spoon down. I know I can't undo what I did, Leo, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to apologize. Really apologize. Not the way I did before, when I was just trying to keep everything from falling apart." Her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself before continuing. "I was selfish. I made choices that hurt you and destroyed our family, and I've regretted it every day since. I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I needed you to hear it from me." I sat there for a moment, processing her words. I had waited for this apology, but now that it was here, it didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. Maybe because no amount of regret or remorse could change what had already happened. "I appreciate the apology," I said slowly, keeping my tone measured. "But it doesn't change the fact that our marriage is over, Madison. I've moved on from that part of my life." "I know," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." There was a long silence between us, the kind that's filled with words unspoken. I didn't feel the same anger toward her that I had in the beginning. Maybe it was because time had dulled the edges of the hurt, or maybe it was because I had finally accepted that our marriage had been broken long before I caught her with Tom. Either way, I felt lighter, like I was finally ready to let go of the bitterness I'd been carrying. "I don't hate you, Madison," I said quietly, surprising myself with the truth in those words. "But I can't go back. I've built a new life for myself, and for Ethan. That's where my focus is now." Madison wiped away a tear, nodding. "I understand. I just hope, one day, you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for me, but for yourself." I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the real challenge was learning to live with the past without letting it define my future. We parted ways that night on civil terms, and as I walked back to my car, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was close, something like acceptance. Madison would always be a part of my life because of Ethan, but the chapter of who we were together was finally closed. In the months that followed, I found a rhythm in my new life. I focused on my business, threw myself into being the best father I could be for Ethan, and slowly started to find joy again in the little things: hikes in the mountains, quiet mornings in the shop, watching Ethan grow into his own person. One day, while we were out camping, Ethan looked at me and said, "Dad, I think I'm okay with everything now. It was hard at first, but I get it. Things change." His words, simple and honest, filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay after all. Life hadn't turned out the way I thought it would. But as I sat by the campfire that night, listening to the crackle of the flames and the soft rustling of the trees, I realized that maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. I had been through hell and back, but I had come out the other side stronger. And most importantly, I still had Ethan by my side. The pain of Madison's betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't define me. It was just one chapter in a much bigger book, and as I sat there with my son, looking up at the stars, I knew that I had the power to write the rest of my story on my terms. Discover more stories. Subscribe today.